Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here with you and to speak about, as a Hungarian former politician, about Poland and Hungarians trying to compare these regimes and also with other regimes as well. Unfortunately, in the last decade, not only among post-communist countries, but even among those post-communist countries which are the members of the EU, we can witness democratic backsliding. And when this phenomenon is mentioned, then the two countries which are mentioned most frequently, this is Poland and Hungary. And of course, the regular phrases and labels, what they used to use for these governments, that these are populist, nationalist government, and they refer mainly to their ideologies. They show and create a vision that these countries are, the autocratic attempts within these countries, they are very similar and the regimes are very similar to each other. What are those basic panels, ideological panels, what are used by both autocratic attempts, the Polish and the Hungarian as well? Both of them, Orban in 2010 after his victory, and Kaczyński after his victory in 2015, they declared that it's not simply a change of government, what they reached, but a kind of change of the regime. And they referred to the original regime change of the 89-90 regime change as a kind of bargain of different elites above the head of the people. And therefore, they referred to it that they can raise the need to have a real regime change, as the regime change of that regime change was stolen by different elites. The second panel, what they use is that the nation is not a company of autonomous citizens of the given countries, but they consider nation a community of people who are committed to an ideology, what they represent, and such a way they try to exclude from the notion of the nation those who are critical towards their regime. At the same time, of course, the next panel is that they both share Eurosceptic views, and as a result of this, they think that they had to carry out a kind of national freedom fight against the dictatorship of Brussels, and this is their real political task. And as a last ideological panel, what they use that, of course, they try to generate and raise the fear and suspicion against refugees, migrants and aliens, and practically I would say that it's trying to create an active xenophobic views and notion among the people. But I think that it's not really a hate campaign what they want to reach, but a kind of fear campaign, because the function of this to raise the fear of their potential voters against the coming of migrants into these countries. But anyway, in spite of the similarities between these ideological panels, I would say that these autocratic attempts, by their very nature, are really, really different. There are two types of post-communist autocracies or autocratic attempts, and my basic statement is that Poland's autocratic attempt can be described as a conservative, an attempt to create a conservative autocracy, while the Hungarian autocratic attempt is a post-communist mafia state. And the difference is really great between these two regimes. If we come back to the ideological aspects, I would say that the basic motivation of the Polish ruling government and Kaczyński is power, concentration of political power, and an ideological indoctrination. I would say that this regime is ideology-driven regime. They are fanatic and emotional at the same time, and as an ideology-driven regime, they are ready even to pay the political price of representing and using some ideological panels. On the other hand, the basic motivations in Hungary is different, of the Orban regimes is different. Of course, it's similar, concentrating political power, but at the same time, the other motive is not ideological indoctrination. The other motive is accumulation of personal wealth. This regime is not ideology-driven, the Hungarian one. It's an ideology-applying regime, mainly cynical and rational at the same time. Although there are basic differences if we regard what is the real structure of decision-making and what is the form and institutional frame of decision-making in these regimes. In the Polish system, the actual decision-making remains centered within the framework of formal institutions, while in the Hungarian one, political and economic decision-making is taken out from the legally defined and formalized institutions. In the case of Poland, the formal body of leadership is the PiS leadership itself. Practically, very roughly, we could say that anybody who has real political power, they have to be the member of the leading organizations of the PiS. I would say, in quotation mark, of course, it's Politburo. But in the case of Hungary, there is an informal body of leadership which consists of persons having formal positions, like in executive power or anywhere else, and at the same time informal positions or not positions at all. And this is what we should call a kind of chief patron's court, like the court of a Tsar, if you want to say this, but much more as a godfather's court. This is, ironically, I would say, contrary to Politburo, it could be Politburo. This is, maybe you will understand this word. While even the ruling parties has a different nature and character in this system. The ruling party, in the case of Poland, is a centralized party. In the Hungarian case, it's a transmission belt party. Transmission belt organization, like the transmission belt organizations during the old communist regimes, at that time the Communist Party had some transmission belt organizations, the different People's Front, the trade unions, the Women's Association, and so on. What means that while in the case of Poland, decisions are taken within the leading political party and its leading body and organization, in the case of Hungary, the Fidesz as a party practically does not bring any decision. In the last 10 years, the Fidesz even do not have official programs. Only Viktor Orban has program and not the party, and not any body of the party accepts formally a party program or anything like this. There is also a difference in how the control over the society and society is tried to build up. In the case of Poland, it's a kind of state dirigi's bureaucratic control, which means that they try to expand the authority of the state, but through the state organizations and these formal institutions. On the other hand, in Hungary there is a so-called single pyramid patronal network. This patronal network is a network of patron clients. It's a patron-client relations, and these patronal networks interweave the different spheres of society. In the case of Poland, those sectors of the society which are not nationalized and not taken under the control of the state, of course they are relatively free. If we think of the economy, this ruling elite still respects the free market competition and freedom of enterprises. In the Hungarian case, it's not the situation. There is a centralized chain of command built on the patron-client networks of vassalage. Therefore, in the case of Poland, you can witness a kind of party political nepotism, Of course, party cadres are put in different positions, but these positions are mainly either in bureaucracy or administration, or let us say at state enterprises. In the Hungarian case, the new form and structure of the ruling elite is the adopted political family, which is like a kind of political economic clan, where not individuals are co-opted into this clan, but practically families are incorporated in this, persons with formal and informal positions as well. Therefore, in spite of the fact that there is a favoritism in the Polish case, but more or less they are fighting corruption. Corruption is not a constitutive element of the system, but it's a deviancy within the system, even if there are some corrupt politicians in the system. In the case of Hungary, we can speak about mafia state, where the governance itself is operated like a criminal organization, which centralizes and monopolizes corruption itself. And therefore, in the case of Poland, the loyal elite is mainly rewarded with offices and not wealth, bureaucratic positions, salaries and so on. In the case of the adopted political family, which accumulates wealth through the bloodless instruments of state coercion. Two major forms of it, the rent-seeking, and the other is centrally led corporate trading. In the last 10 years in Hungary, according to the fact-finding journalists, more than 400 enterprises were taken away from their owners with the means of state coercion and rechanneled within the realm of the adopted political family. This is why I would say that the attempt, what we can see in Poland, it's an attempt to create an authoritarian state in a classic way, a conservative autocracy. But in the case of Hungary, it's a criminal state, which is a privatized form of a perversized state. So I would say that in spite of the fact that these regimes are using similar ideological panels, the real nature of these autocratic attempts are really different. If we want to understand how these regimes work, and we try to fight against them, then we have to find a real description for that, which makes a real difference in their nature. Now, what are the constraints of these autocratic attempts in this system? I would say that Poland is still far from the point of no return. Still, it's not a conservative autocracy. There is an autocratic attempt, but there is not an autocratic breakthrough yet. Hungary is close or even beyond the point of no return. And what are those things which favors for resistance of such attempts in Poland, and what we do not have yet? In Hungary, the disproportional election system made it possible to gain an constituting majority, a supermajority in the parliament for the Orban regime. In 2010, with 53% of the votes, they gained 67% of the seats. Then they unilaterally changed the constitution and invaded the positions of the institutions which would serve as institutions of checks and balances in the democracy, and manipulated elections. And the next election is in 2014. They gained only 44% of the votes, but with this 44%, they got again 67% of the seats in the parliament. And the last elections last year, they gained 48% of the votes, and with this 48%, they gained 67% of the seats again in the parliament. So while in Poland still the elections are free and more or less fair elections, in Hungary they are manipulated elections. The second obstacle which would be useful to avoid autocratic attempts is the divided executive power and the directly elected president, which means that if the executive power is divided and both the president the Prime Minister and the government has real authority and competencies, they can balance each other. In Hungary, there is no divide the executive power. The president is elected by the parliament. Even in the third round, half of the MPs can elect him, and there is a weak presidential legitimacy. Therefore, it helps for the power concentration. In Poland, there is a strong traditions of resistance and collective resistance. In Hungary, we have traditions much more in individual bargaining with the power. In Poland, you have moderate right and liberal parties, PO and Nowoczesna, while in Hungary we do not have such parties, which could be considered moderate right-wing parties or even liberal parties. Peace in Poland was on the right edge of the political spectrum, therefore it was more easy to have a coalition for the opposition parties. But in Hungary, until 2019, the Fidesz had a central position, a tripartite political field we had, which hampered the cooperation of different political parties. Now it changed just now for the what we'll have in October, the municipal elections, where on a base of system-critic paradigm, practically all opposition parties try to cooperate with each other. In Poland, you have autonomous private enterprises, which are not yet brought under the control of the government. We do not have this situation. We have vassalized private enterprises. Any private enterprise can be a target of central government predation, which uses politically selective law enforcement just to blackmail or even to expropriate these enterprises. In Poland, most of the municipal governments, especially the most important towns, are under the control of the opposition forces, while in Hungary it's absolutely not the case. And you still have a firm independent media platforms, in spite of the fact that I know that the public media, the state media, is occupied by the government, but still you have a lot of free private media outlets, while in Hungary it does not exist. So when we are speaking about that what are the chances to get rid of these autocratic regimes, we would say that the process of democratic backsliding could be separated in three phases: autocratic attempt, the second autocratic breakthrough, and autocratic consolidation. Here in Poland you have an autocratic attempt, but still you do not have an autocratic breakthrough. I mean an autocratic breakthrough when the ruling party or the ruling political forces has the monopoly of political power. The monopoly of political power, according to me, means that they can change the constitution and all laws as they wish, as single actors, and they can deploy and nominate and appoint the heads of the institutions of checks and balances as they wish. It did not happen here yet. So, therefore, I think that in Poland there is still a possibility of electoral correction. But when you have an autocratic breakthrough already, it can happen that you can change the system with electoral restitution, but in a lot of cases only with extra electoral restitution. And if you have autocratic consolidation, which means that beyond seizing the monopoly of political power, practically you monopolize the media, you vassalize the economic sphere, you subjugate the NGOs and the civil sector and the citizens, then we can speak about autocratic consolidation. In Hungary, now we have a kind of autocratic consolidation. And practically I am very skeptic concerning whether simply through electoral processes you can change the situation or not. Of course, it's a real challenge for the EU, how to handle such countries, which can be, like Hungary, which can be considered a criminal state without any chance for electoral restitution in this country. So these examples shows already that different countries on the level of ideological panels seem to be very similar to each other, but they are really very different type of countries. Therefore, we should say that during the regime change, we had an illusion that there is a linear progress toward liberal democracies, and you can build any kind of regimes, any kind of liberal regimes or democratic regimes at the ruins of different dictatorships. But it's not the case. It's not really the case, and it's not an accidental thing that the transitional literature, which described the situation as a transition, where it was just a question of time that from a communist dictatorship you will become a liberal democracy, well, it just failed. And then I would say the transitology was replaced by hybridology, which says, okay, somehow we have to accept that there are stabilized political regimes between liberal democracy and dictatorship, and it's not just a transitory status of them, and it's not a teleological process at the end of which you have to reach that situation. One of the Hungarian authors, János Kornai, who is a famous economist, just made a difference between the three models: democracy, autocracy, and dictatorship. And now I would like just to emphasize what is the four primary features along which he made a difference between these three types of regimes. One is, of course, that the government cannot be removed through a peaceful and civilized procedure. I think this is the case already in Hungary, but it's not the case in Poland. Institutions which could concertedly guarantee accountability are either formal or weak. Legal parliamentary opposition exists, but multiple parties run for elections, but without any chance to change the regime. No terror in a large scale, and large-scale detention as in the communist dictatorships. But occasionally, of course, they use even physical coercion and different illegal means to destroy opposition. The mainstream politology has some constraints when they try to describe these post-communist regimes. I would mention two major things. They are concentrating only or mainly on political institutions. This is one thing, one problem. And the other problem is that they use the language to describe the post-communist regimes, the language of liberal democracies, and it shows that they think that the post-communist regimes, which are not still liberal democracies, they are just deviances of liberal democracies, and they can be described properly with that vocabulary. But not this is the case, because in the post-communist regimes there are stubborn structures, I would say, which create a kind of past dependency in the evolution of these regimes. Of course, one major thing is the lack of separation of spheres of social action, and from this, what I mentioned already can be derived that there are, instead of formal institutions, you have informal networks, and these informal networks are hierarchical, and this hierarchical into informal networks has a patron-client relations character, and this is what I call that the ruling elite is a kind of adopted political family, it's a kind of political economic clan. On the other hand, of course, there is a collusion of power and ownership, which means that in post-communist autocracies, which type can be called patron-client autocracies, There is no power without ownership, there is no ownership without power. There is a patrimonialization process, what we can witness, which means that there is an appropriation of the state authorities for private gains, and of course it results centralized and monopolized forms of corruption. So therefore, instead of just an axis between liberal democracy and dictatorship, and trying to put these countries, position these countries on this axis, that how far are they from the liberal democracy end or to the dictatorship, communist dictatorship end, I propose another approach which differentiates 6 basic types of regimes. You know, liberal democracy, I won't say what it is, you know, but among democracies, as I double the patterns of democracy, autocracy and dictatorships, we define a kind of patronal democracy, patron-client democracy, which means that in these patron-client democracies, you won't find ruling parties similar to liberal democracies, ruling parties what you can witness in liberal democracies, but its political parties, practically, they are the covers of rivaling patron-client networks. But in this case, in the case of patronal democracy, none of the patron-client networks are in the position that they can destroy, subordinate each other. In the case of autocracies, we can make a difference between conservative autocracy, and you can now see the countries positioned in this triangle now. They reflect to the situation of 2018. You know that Poland is starting going into that direction, which means that, of course, they try to monopolize the political power, but at the other hand, the private economy and other spheres of social actions, they remain untouched and not so subordinated. In the case of patronal autocracy, where you can find, let us say, Hungary, Russia, Kazakhstan, etc., in this case, they belong into practically in one group. These are what I call criminal states or post-communist mafia states. There, a single pyramid patron-client network monopolizes power and practically invades the different spheres of society. And there is one more, this is what I call market-exploiting dictatorship, which means that and China is very close to that model, where you have a political monopoly of one party, there is a one-party system, but on the other hand, there is a strong development of market relations and market economy. Now, let's see that what are those different dimensions or layers along with we can try to make a coherent system. If we take the traditional politological distinctions, we can make, of course, the difference between liberal democracy, electoral democracy, competitive authoritarian regime, hegemonic authoritarian regime, or closed authoritarian regime. But we see that if we try to position one or another country in this, then even if they belong, let us say, to the hegemonic authoritarian regimes, they can be very far from each other by nature. Another dimension is that what is the plurality of power networks and how does it combine with the legitimacy of the regimes. The two democracies, liberal and patronal democracies, you can find their multi-pyramid power networks, and in a Max Weberian term, they have a legal rational legitimacy. While in the autocracies and dictatorships, you have a single pyramid power networks, and another type of legitimacy, substantive rational legitimacy, which means that for certain reasons, you can just overcome constitutions and not to take it too seriously, the rule of law, of course. Another dimension is that what is the limited nature of power, while in liberal democracies and even in patronal democracies can be considered limited. In autocracies unconstrained, while in a communist system it's totalitarian. What I started to speak about the ruling parties, so the ruling parties members in a liberal democracy and even in a conservative autocracy, they are politicians. in a communist dictatorship or in a Chinese dictatorship, they are cadres, not politicians in the sense of Western democracies. And in patronal democracies or patronal autocracies, they are much more like vessels of these parties. And therefore, we can say that in liberal democracies, patronal democracies, and conservative autocracies, these ruling parties are governing parties, which means that the decisions are taken within the parties and the policy is making, and more or less within the frame of legality and formality. While in the communist dictatorship and party in China, it's a state party. While I mentioned the patronal autocracy like Hungary, Russia, Kazakhstan, it's transmission belt parties. These parties, the Fidesz or the United Russia in Russia, they do not decide about anything. They just fulfill what the adopted political family decides in the so-called chief patron's court about them. Then what is the patronalism of rule? That there are non-patronal relations, bureaucratic patronal, for example, the nomenclature in a communist system, or informal patronal, what I meant and mentioned, the adopted political family clan. They are informal patronal relations. Next dimension is the formality of institutions and of power. They are mainly dominated by formal regulations. In patronal democracies and market exploiting dictatorships, it's semi-formal. It's a combination of formal and informal rule, while in a patronal autocracy, the dominant element is the informal ruling in these societies. If we speak about the economic system, we say that we can see that the dominant, if we think of Karl Polanyi's distinctions, that the dominant economic integration is the market coordination, and the dominant form of property is private property. In a communist dictatorship, you have a bureaucratic resource redistribution and state property dominance, while in a patronal autocracy you have a relational market redistribution, which means that the adopted political family practically, with its informal methods, redistributes the market and not the resources, definitely. And the dominant form of property is power ownership. What I mentioned, there is no power without ownership, there is no ownership without power in these systems. The corruption is also the dominant form of corruption. We can say that in liberal democracies, even conservative autocracies, to market exploiting dictatorships, that corruption is system destroying. In a communist dictatorship like old Soviet republics and Russia, it's system lubricating corruption when it's moderately tolerated, because among the conditions of the shortage economy, you need to have some corruption, but it's only moderately tolerated. While in patronal autocracy, the corruption is system constituting corruption. It's not a deviant element of the regime, but it's the basic organizational form when the patronal autocracy is organized as a criminal state and the governance is operated like a criminal organization. Hungary, Russia, Azerbaijan, Central Asian countries, I would say. About ideology, I would say that liberal democracy is ideology neutral, which does not mean that the actors would be ideologically neutral, but the regime and the system, of course, is an ideologically neutral regime. While conservative autocracies and communist dictatorships are ideology-driven, and patronal autocracies are ideology-applying one, as I mentioned in the comparison of Poland and Hungary. And the autonomy of civil societies is free, subjugated, and non-existence. So these are different layers. And when we try to position a country in a certain time within this triangle, then they consequently should belong and to show in these dimensions to present a coherent explanation for their real nature. Now, after the regime change, just with the regime change, we had four typical trajectories. These were primary trajectories which resulted the ABC trajectories after the collapse of the communist regimes, retreat or collapse of the communist regimes. One trajectory was from communist dictatorship to liberal democracy, which means that it became from a single pyramid bureaucratic patronal formation, a multi-pyramid non-patronal one. Of course, at the beginning, Estonia, Poland and Hungary just run on this way. This was the primary trajectory. The second one, to the B, where is a regime change, of course, second regime change, where from a communist dictatorship becomes a patronal democracy. Those countries which were never liberal democracies. It's not a democratic backsliding what they faced, but they never were, even after the regime change. For example, Romania, Ukraine. Then they go to patronal democracy. And the third one, and this belongs mainly to the Central Asian countries, Central Asian post-Soviet republics, when directly they become from communist dictatorship a patronal autocracy, which means that from a single pyramid, bureaucratic patronal system, they become a single pyramid, informal patronal system. In the case of Kazakhstan, for example, the ruling elite of the Communist Party and the KGB just transformed themselves into the new ruling elite, and they directly, without any so-called deviation of democratic deviation. So if we see, let's take the first case as a trajectory. This is the case of Estonia. The next one, the second one, as we take, for example, Romania, they had such a trajectory. They never reached liberal democratic status. The third one is Kazakhstan, what I mentioned, but Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, they are practically the same, which even were not patronal democracies. They were not rivaling. You could not witness an equilibrium of rivaling patronal networks. And the fourth one is China, where you could not speak about regime change, but a model change, very similar, very close to that what we had in Hungary in the 80s, late 70s and 80s, where we tried to keep the monopoly of the Communist Party and at the same time somehow to have the private sector to evolve and to evolve some private market, somehow simulating market situations. This was so-called socialist market, etc., etc. But then the regime change came, the collapse of the communist system, and etc. But China, at that time, Chinese officials came a lot of time to Hungary to watch how the system works, and they have this model. And now we can see the so-called secondary trajectories of post-communist regimes. And secondary trajectories, we see that this is a part of this is the case of the so-called democratic backsliding. When countries who became liberal democracies, from liberal democracies they started to go back. One is, on the way Poland is, but of course did not reach the conservative autocracy. The A went it goes from a liberal democracy towards conservative autocracy, when a multi-pyramid non-patronal system should be transformed into a single pyramid non-patronal formalized system. The B model is when from a liberal democracy is becoming a patronal democracy, when from a multi-pyramid non-patronal system you create a multi-pyramid informal patronal system. And the C1, the last one, and the C, when it becomes a patronal autocracy. Hungary from a liberal democracy, Russia from a patronal democracy or oligarchic anarchy, much more. So if we see these countries, we see the Polish way, the secondary trajectory after regime change, after 2015, into this direction. The next country, Czech Republic now. If we take the party of Babiš, it's also already a kind of patron-client network. Most of his leading politicians are his employees or were his employees in his enterprises. This is an attempt to create a Vezel party instead of a Western-type political party and even not a centralized party, but a Vezel party. But of course, they are very at the beginning and there is a strong resistance. It's just still a minor, not so strong like in Poland, a minor autocratic attempt, far from autocratic breakthrough and even farther from autocratic consolidation. This is the Hungarian case, We had a kind of, we got too close to patronal democracy system where the socialists and the Fidesz evolving patron-client networks had a balance practically between 2002 and 2010, and then after 2010 this balance was abolished with the two-thirds majority in the parliament, and the patronal autocracy was built out. The autocratic breakthrough happened in 2010, and since 2010, 2011, 2012, what's going on is the autocratic consolidation. And this is Russia, you know, which did not reach the situation of patronal democracy. The Yeltsin time could be described much more as a kind of oligarchic anarchy, but later Putin came, centralized it, and became a patronal autocracy. Now let's take two other countries, Ukraine, you see, because my basic statement, if you have a patronal democracy and any of the patron-client networks gets into power, they try to monopolize it. Therefore, there is a cycle of these autocratic attempts. But then in Ukraine were the Orange Revolution, then the Maidan Revolution, and it came back. But we can say why they did not were transformed into liberal democracies. Because these changes in the political regime, these restorations, were not accompanied by anti-patronal transformation. Some discontent oligarchic groups, they supported those masses which wanted to go back to a democratic situation, but then the whole thing started from again, and it gives a special cycles of this. This is what's happening in the case of Moldova as well. And now it's finished, and now for 1 minute I try to show you that how we try to represent this in a 3D dimensional network. So this is what I showed you already, and here in this basic thing we can put even trajectories. Now let's see the Polish one as we are here now in Poland, and with the time you can start it as it goes in time, but now I bring it to this. You can see this. Where is it now? And let's take the Hungarian one to show where is Hungary. We can eliminate the dates of these trajectories, but at the same time, now we eliminate the rules as well. This is the situation in 2018, and this is what I wanted to show you. That if we have only the axis of democracy and dictatorship, it seems that they are on the same way and they are somehow very close to each other. Poland is such a little bit behind of Hungary in this autocratization process. But if we see this model, we see that, of course, they are both autocratic attempts, but in nature, they are really very far from each other. And if we want to have, logically, to see that in the different other dimensions how they work, then you see that coherently, you can see that any element of these things what we take out, and you can see that, for example, in this system, if we take now the, I put it back, this is the ruling party's function, or we can go back to the ideological place, then we see that it's from ideology neutral, it's going to an ideology driven place, it's an ideology applying one, or if we see the dominant economic mechanism in other respect, we see that in the given moment, Poland is still a competitive market economy. This is the dominant force, in spite of the fact that the the scope of the state enterprises is expanding, etc., but still the dominant economic integration form is competitive market, and the dominant property form is private property, like in Hungary is within the relational market redistribution. And in such a way, we try to build up oh yes, actually, I go back. So in such a way, we try to build up a model where you can compare these countries and to see that in a certain moment, for example, we go back, then you see in 2008, where are these countries? You know, they are still, Poland is still a liberal democracy. Hungary is just moving towards the towards the patronal democracy. So it's the need to create a comprehensive and coherent model, the need to create a new language. At the same time, we tried to demonstrate it on a 3D version, which helps to understand the real move of these regimes. Thank you very much for your attention.